misinterpreting handwriting, and so on. Then we'll talk about Americanization of names, how names were adapted and chosen when the immigrant moved to a new country. And then we'll conclude with some demographics and popularity statistics on which given names were most common in 19th century Poland, 20th century America, and Israel. Now, I'm going to start with an example, and this personal example will illustrate the importance of understanding Jewish given names in Jewish genealogical research. My grandfather had a first cousin who was listed by various names in different sources. The first document illustrated here is his 1881 civil marriage registration from Novigrad Lomzha Gubernia, Russian Poland, which lists him in Russian as Lebka Gierszkiewicz Dembor, or transcribed into Polish, Lebka Gierszkiewicz Dembor. So this is the Polish name of a Yiddish-speaking Jew written in Russian. And it basically means Leib, the son of Hirsch, and his last name is Dembor. Now, this same man's tombstone, he was buried in Brooklyn in 1926, is inscribed Mordechai Yehuda ben Tzvi, which means Mordechai Yehuda, the son of Tzvi. And in English, it says Max Goldman. Now, believe it or not, these two sources refer to one and the same person. And hopefully, during the rest of this lecture, we'll illustrate how we know that Lebka Gierszkiewicz Dembor is Max Goldman. Now, most Jews have two names, a religious name and a secular name. A religious name and an everyday name. The religious name is known in Hebrew as the Shem HaKodesh, or the holy name, and it's used in the synagogue. The secular name is known as a Kanui, and it's the name that you use every day. So in Eastern Europe, that would be a Yiddish name. In America or England today, that would be an English name. In France, a French name. In ancient Babylonia, a Babylonian name, and so on. Now, the Shem HaKodesh is used only in a religious context. When you're called to the Torah for an aliyah, on a marriage contract, the ketubah, in a divorce get, and on a Hebrew tombstone, a matzeva. And on the other hand, the kanui, the secular name, was used in everyday life, and that's the name that appears in civil records, government birth, marriage, and death records, census records, passenger lists, and so on. Now, most of the Shem HaKodeshim, the religious records, are Hebrew names, and most of them are biblical names. There are a few non-biblical Hebrew names, such as Chaim, Meir, Nachman, and Malka, and there are a handful of Persian, Babylonian, and Greek names, such as Alexander, Mordechai, and Kalman, and a few names that have snuck in from other European languages. But the vast majority of the Shem HaKodesh are from Hebrew sources. Now, Ashkenazic Jews, Jews from Eastern Europe, use a distinct pattern for given names. Eastern European Jews name a child after a deceased ancestor or relative to keep the name alive. And genealogically, this custom gives us clues as to when someone died. I have to stress that this is a custom, it's a tradition. There are no halachic Jewish laws concerning it. It's not mentioned in the Torah or Talmud, and virtually everyone in the Torah has a unique name. This custom developed around the 1st or 2nd century and became common practice around the 12th century. And now this custom enables us to estimate an ancestor's date of death. So here's a sample family tree. Let me see, can you see the laser pointer? I can't hear anyone. I will assume you can. So here's a sample.
The mic was on mute. There was a big yes, and you've been getting a lot of laughs as well. I'm just letting you know. We're going back on mute.
Oh, okay. Now I can't hear the feedback. Oh, no. Okay. Anyway, so here's a sample family tree with a patriarch named Moshe. He has grandchildren named Moshe, born 1901, 1899, and 1900. So from this, we can conclude that these three grandchildren were named after him, and that Moshe, the grandparent, probably died shortly before 1899. Now, a child is generally named for the closest deceased relative for whom no one else has been named. Boys are named for boys, and girls are named for girls, with rare exceptions. So here's the list of priorities. The child is named for the father or mother if they're deceased at the time. And this is usually independent of the sex of the child. So this is the exception to the boys named for boys and girls named for girls rule. So the only situation where a Moshe ben Moshe could occur is if the father died before the child was born, or if a mother died during childbirth, the child would be named after the mother, regardless of sex. Typically, that is not the case, so the child is named after a deceased grandparent or great-grandparent in that order. If two grandparents are dead, perhaps the child could be given a double name, one for each grandparent. Now, Ashkenazim did not name for a living relative, and they did not name after a deceased sibling. But this custom does not apply to Sephardim or Hasidim, who had their own set of naming traditions. Now, not all children are named after relatives. You run out of dead relatives after a while, especially in a family where you have 10 or 12 children and a high rate of infant mortality. Only a handful might survive to adulthood, so therefore sometimes other sources were used. And among these sources are what we call the timely names, where the child is named after the time of year that they were born. So a child born around the holiday of Purim might be named Esther or Mordechai, who are the heroes of the Purim story. A child born during Passover might be named Pesach. A child born on the Sabbath might be named Shabtai or Shepsel, the Yiddish version. A child born during the Hebrew month of Nisan might be named Nisan. A child born during the Hebrew month of Av might be named Menachem. However, someone named Pesach wasn't necessarily born on Pesach, but could have been named after someone born on Pesach. My grandfather was named Pesach, and he wasn't born during Passover. He was named after his grandfather named Pesach. And the same is true with other timely names, so you have to be careful not to overinterpret and assume that someone was born at a particular time of year because of their names. Now, another category of names are what we call amuletic names, or names given for good luck. Sometimes these were given as a new or additional name when a child became very sick. A Jewish superstition that began during the Middle Ages imagined the angel of death as a rather bureaucratic fellow with perhaps a list of names and a clipboard who went around collecting souls, and it was thought that if he came looking for a sick child with a specific name and he couldn't find a child with that name, then the angel of death would be fooled and would leave and spare the sick child. So here are some examples of amuletic names. Alter and Alta, which mean old man and old woman in Yiddish. Zaidi and Baba, which mean grandfather and grandmother in Yiddish. Chaim and Chaya, which mean life in Hebrew. Or Vita or Vitella, which mean life based on the Latin Romance languages. Now, although amuletic names were sometimes given as a second name when a child was sick and was older, this wasn't always the case. Some of these children were given these amuletic names at birth. Here's a picture of my great-great-grandfather, whom the family always referred to as Alter Chiel, old man Chiel. Now, I assume they called him that because they only knew him as an old man. But when I found his birth registration on microfilm, he was born in Chęcin, Poland in 1856, he is clearly given the name Alter Chiel, old man Chiel, at birth. Now, why would a couple give their baby a name meaning old man? Well, if you look at the family tree, you will see that two former children died in infancy, age 3 and aged 1, and he was given the name Old Man in the hope that he would live to fulfill the meaning of his name. And several years ago, when I visited my ancestral town in Poland, I found this great-great-grandfather's death record in a 1940 registration book with a swastika on it, and he was 84 when the Nazis occupied Chęcin. So he indeed did live to fulfill the meaning of his name. But again, you shouldn't overinterpret these names. Someone named Alter wasn't necessarily born after siblings who died young, but could be named after an ancestor named Alta, which is the case for my mother's brother, Alan, who was named Alter after this great-grandfather, Alter. Now, today we tend to think that an individual has one name, his or her real name, and that remains that person's name for life. And that certainly was not the case with our ancestors. They frequently had many, many names and nicknames, often in different languages. Now, genealogists need to learn the commonly related names or learn where to research these names, because sometimes when we can't find an ancestor under one name, we might locate him under a different name. Now, our ancestors had multiple names. These names might be unrelated or related to each other. Given names that were related could be related to each other in a variety of ways. Biblical associations, historical associations, calque loan translations, variants, diminutives, language versions, and adaptations. And I'll explain each of these types in the following slides. Now, the first type of relationship are what we call unrelated names, two distinct names that have nothing to do with each other. For example, Sarah Rivka, Abram Moshe, Rocheleah, David Hirsch. So it could be someone who was named after two different individuals, or someone who was named after one individual with a double name. Now, unfortunately for genealogists, any given document might show one name or the other name or both names in either order, as illustrated here. So one document might refer to a person as Abram Moshe, while another document says his name is Moshe Abram, while another document just calls him Abram, and another document just calls him Moshe. They're all the same person. So the pattern of recording names was completely inconsistent, and you have to be aware to research under all possibilities. These name pairs were not like a first name and a middle name. There's really no such concept as a middle name in the Jewish naming tradition. My grandfather had a cousin named Pesach Hirsch, who was married to a woman named Miriam Rivka. So in some of the records, Pesach is married to Miriam, sometimes Pesach is married to Rivka, sometimes Hirsch is married to Rivka, sometimes Hirsch is married to Miriam. I thought there was a whole lot of hanky-panky going on until I figured out that each of them had a double name, and the records simply used one or the other in various instances. Now, there are other types of names, other pairs of names that are related to each other. And the major category of related names are what we call biblical associations, which derive from the blessings that the patriarch Jacob, gave to his children and grandchildren in the book of Genesis, chapters 48 and 49, Parshat Vayechi. There he referred to his grandson or his son Naphtali to a running stag, to a deer. And Hirsch means deer in Yiddish, so the names Naphtali and Hirsch are a biblical association. Hirsch is the Kanui, is the associated name of the name Hirsch. His grandson Benjamin, he compared to a wolf. Wolf means wolf in Yiddish, so the name pair Benjamin and wolf are a Kanui pair. He said of his son Ephraim that his descendants would be as multiply as the fish of the sea. Therefore, the fish became a symbol of Ephraim, and the Yiddish name Fischl means fish and became associated with Ephraim. Yehuda or Judah was associated with a lion. Leib means lion in Yiddish, so Yehuda and Leib are a biblical association. And of his son Issachar, he said, Issachar is a large-boned ass or a donkey. Now, the donkey has been replaced by a bear in the Ashkenazi tradition. In ancient times, a donkey was the symbol of hard work and endurance, but in Western culture, the donkey, I guess, had a more negative connotation, so they replaced it with a bear. So the Hebrew name Yisachar and the Yiddish name bear have a biblical association. The word Kanui is a noun which appears in the Talmud. It means a by-name or a substitute name, and it's a secular given name that relates to the sacred Hebrew name in some way. So in addition to these biblical associations, another way that names could be related to each other are through other historical associations. Some of these are from biblical sources, some are from semantic reasons or mere phonetic reasons. The origins of some are debatable, but that's well beyond the scope of this lecture. You can find out more of about these in the books that I will mention later and that are also mentioned in your handout. Now, another major category are what we call calques or loan translations of the underlying meaning of a name from one language to another. The word calque is a linguistic term from the French word meaning to copy. So a calque is a borrowing, a translation of a word with the same meaning into another language. While names themselves can't be translated, some names have an underlying meaning, and it is possible to translate that meaning from one language into another. So for example, here are some Hebrew to Yiddish calques. Arya and Leib mean lion in Hebrew and Yiddish respectively. Zev and Wolf mean wolf in Hebrew and Yiddish respectively. Dove and bear mean bear. Tzvi and Hirsch mean deer. Tzippa and Fega mean bird. Asher and Zelig mean happy. Shraga and Feivel mean light or candle. Now, but recall that through the biblical association, the lion is the symbol of Yehuda, Judah, so we find that all three names, Yehuda, Arya, and Leib, are all associated and thus might occur together in various combinations. For example, Arya Leib or Yehuda Leib. So the table on this slide, which is also on the first page of your handout, can be very helpful. It shows the Hebrew Shem HaKodesh, the Hebrew biblical tribal symbol Kanui, and the Yiddish calque of that symbol. So anyone with the Yiddish name Hirsch is called to the Torah in Hebrew as Tzvi, since God only speaks Hebrew. Hirsch is the secular everyday name, which will appear on civil documents, while the Hebrew name Tzvi will always be used for religious functions, such as on a marriage ketubah or a tombstone. So therefore, it's possible for someone to actually have three distinct names. And if someone had a double name of unrelated names, they might have 6 different names, plus each name has diminutives. So, how many names can one person have? You do the math. You should keep this table of biblical associations and calques handy as a reference. We will be referring to it later, and it will be on the final exam. But seriously, these 4 sets of names do come up frequently. 1 in 6 of all Jewish males has one of these 4 symbolic names. A 4th category of associations are what we call language variants, names that vary somewhat between Hebrew and Yiddish. Usually when a Hebrew name is rendered in Yiddish, the pronunciation changes slightly. Sometimes consonants are elided together, or consonant clusters are simplified, unstressed vowels are eliminated, consonants are assimilated. So Avraham becomes Avram, Yehuda becomes Yudah, Yitzchak becomes Itzik, Mordechai becomes Mordechai, Yaakov becomes Yankif becomes Yankel, Yosef becomes Yosel, and generally the transformations are pretty obvious. Pronunciation is all that changes with most feminine names, but the Hebrew consonants are the same. So Rachel becomes Rachel, Devorah becomes Dvorah, Yocheved becomes Yochvet, and so on. Now, the 5th category of name relationships is the largest types. These are diminutives or nicknames. For genealogical research purposes, it's the Yiddish name, the secular vernacular name that was used in Eastern Europe, that you'll want to discover, because that's the name that will be written on government documents in Russian, Polish, Hungarian, and so on. Now, many Yiddish nicknames are very similar to the religious Hebrew name, as we saw on the last slide, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, or Avram, Itzik, and Yankov, but others can be quite different. Now, most English-speaking people are familiar with the way that nicknames and diminutives are formed in America. Typically, the last syllable is removed, and sometimes a long E sound is appended to make it diminutive. So, for example, Joseph is truncated to Joe. You add the long E sound, and it becomes Joey. Some Anglo-Saxon names often change the first letter of a diminutive. So Robert is truncated to Rob. You change the first letter, make it Bob. You add the long E sound, it becomes Bobby. William is truncated to Will. You change the first letter and make it Bill. You add the long E sound, it becomes Billy. Theodore becomes Ted, becomes Teddy. Edward becomes Ed, becomes Eddie. Richard becomes Rich, becomes Rick, becomes Dick. Now, any American speaker can easily identify that Dick is short for Richard, or that Bobby is the same person as Robert, but that convention is not at all obvious to a non-English speaker. And the same thing is true for Yiddish names. Nicknames that are very obvious to a Yiddish speaker will not be obvious to someone who's unfamiliar with that language. Now, often to create a Yiddish name, it's the first part of the Hebrew name that's dropped. So you take prefixes of Hebrew names to make Yiddish ones. So here are some examples. Ephraim in Hebrew becomes Froyim in Yiddish. Elchanan in Hebrew becomes Hanan in Yiddish. Ishaya in Hebrew becomes Shaya in Yiddish. Yisrael becomes Struel. Alexander becomes Sender. Eliezer becomes Lazer. Yechezkel becomes Chetzkel. I'm using the Polish spellings here. Yerachmiel becomes Rachmiel. Yekutiel becomes Kushel. Itzalel becomes Itzalel. Avigdor becomes Vigdor. Issachar becomes Socher. Nathaniel becomes Saniel. Emmanuel becomes Maniel, Yechiel becomes Chiel, Yedidiah becomes Didya, Elimelech becomes Melech, and Bathsheba becomes Sheva. You'll note that this prefix truncation doesn't often happen with female names, since most female names are already 2 syllables, but there are a handful of cases, such as Bathsheba being truncated to Sheva, Nechama becomes Chama, and Menucha becoming Nucha. Now, sometimes you can make a diminutive by adding a suffix. Just like Joe becomes Joey, little Joe, by adding the long E sound, you can add a ka or ek or el or ush to a male Yiddish name to make a diminutive. Moshe can become Moshek, Bear can become Beryl or Berka or Bertsha, Leib becomes Label or Labish or Leibka, Hirsch becomes Herschel or Hershka. Now, depending upon the region, diminutive suffixes can sometimes be formed by using an L or an Ek or something else. The Ka suffix is Slavic, the L or the Dul are Germanic. The suffix ish was popular in Galicia, Hungary, and Romania, and Alexander Bader's book, The Dictionary of Ashkenazic Given Names, will describe which suffixes were common in which regions. Now, popular diminutive endings for Yiddish female names are L or Dul, such as when Shana becomes Shendel, Reza becomes Razel, Fega becomes Fegel, Chana becomes Chendel, Brena becomes Brendel. We still use this name pattern within my own family. My sister Randy we call Rendell, and my uncle's wife's name is Eve, and he calls her Evil. Now, just as English names undergo multiple transformations to form nicknames, the same is true for Yiddish names. So some Yiddish names are formed by both truncating the first syllable and then also adding a diminutive suffix. So Yisrael, you truncate the prefix to make it Srul, you add an ik suffix to make it Srulik. But Salel becomes Tzalka. Yishaya becomes Shaika. Ephraim becomes Froim, becomes Froimel. Dobra becomes Dobrush, becomes Dabrushka. Now, there are many other transformations of this type to form Yiddish nicknames. Zacharia becomes Charia, becomes Sharka. Shabtai becomes Shapsa, becomes Shepsel. Yaakov can become Yankel. Yaakov can become Kopel. Yaakov can become Kiva and Kivel. And Shmuel becomes Zamuel, becomes Zanuel, becomes Zanvel. Now, this last one brings up an interesting case. It's a peculiar variation where you insert the V sound, which is represented by the letter W in Polish, or the third letter of the Cyrillic alphabet, which looks like a uppercase B, but it has the V sound. And this phenomena occurs in northeastern Yiddish, Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus. So Moshe can become Movsha, Noach can become Novach, Yoel becomes Yovel, Yonah becomes Yovna, Shaul becomes Shevel, Yehosha becomes Ovje, Pinchas becomes Pinchas, and Shmuel becomes Zainvil. Now, each name has many, many variants. There are really only about 100 different male names and 100 different female names in common usage, and I've included those on the middle 2 pages of your handout. But each name has dozens of variants in diminutive, and each of those variants could have dozens of spelling in various languages and alphabets. So shown here are over 100 variants of the biblical Hebrew name Miriam, the sister of Moses. So Miriam, Miriam, Merlin, Miril, Mirila, Mirla, Mirka, Mira, Mirush, Mirushka, Mirashka, Mirza, Maria, Mariashka, Masha, Mashal, Mashka, Manya, Manyushka, and so on are all variants of the Hebrew name Miriam. Now, unfortunately, some Yiddish nicknames are ambiguous, just as is true of English names. For example, in English, Ed could be a nickname for Edward or Edmund or Edgar. And Al can be a nickname for Alan or Albert or Alfred or Alvin or Alexander. So if you know only that someone's nickname is Al, you don't necessarily know what their full name is. And the same phenomenon does exist in Yiddish. In Yiddish, Nissel could be a nickname for either of the Hebrew names Nisan or Natan. Hanan or Hona could be a nickname for either Elchanan or Yochanan. Eta or Ita or Itol could be a diminutive for either Esther or Yehudit. Tevel could be a nickname for either Tuvia or David, and Shevel could be a nickname for either Shebach or Shaul. So again, if you know only the nickname, there isn't necessarily a way to determine the full name. And other Yiddish nicknames are similar to each other and may be ambiguous or easily confused. For example, Heschel is the diminutive of the Hebrew name Yehoshua, Joshua, but Herschel is a nickname for Hirsch. Shia is a diminutive for Yehoshua, I'm assuming that's Shia, but Shia is the diminutive of the Hebrew name Yeshaya or Isaiah. So, and depending upon the region or the pronunciation or the transliteration scheme that's used, either diminutive might possibly refer to either Hebrew name, so they can be a little confusing. Now, names by definition don't have meaning. They are references to objects. They mean the person that they refer to. So a name's underlying meaning sometimes isn't very important. Most people today don't know the meaning of their own English names. It often has very little bearing on genealogical research. I have no idea what Warren means. However, many people are fascinated by the meaning of names. So name meanings, the underlying meanings of Jewish names can fall into several different categories. There are the traditional biblical names, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Sarah, Rachel, Leah, and Rebecca, which have underlying meanings that are theological or obscure or debatable. Then there are the names whose underlying meaning is the name of an animal. Arya and Leib mean lion, Zev and Wolf mean wolf, Zvi and Hirsch mean deer, Dove and bear mean bear, Fischl means fish, Devora means bee, Tzvia and Hinda mean doe, Tzipora and Fega mean bird. There are several Yiddish female names which are colors, referring to complexion or hair color or eye color. Brena means brown, Charna means black, Gela means yellow or blonde, Gruna means green, and Rosa means red. And then there are several female names that reflect personal qualities. Shena and Bela mean beautiful, Liba means lovable, Malka means queen, Tova, Dobra, and Gittel mean good, and so on. And then there are also the timely names and the amuletic names, the names for good luck, which we discussed earlier. Now, there are many books which you can refer to discover a name's etymology, history, and variants. These books are listed in the bibliography on the last page of your handout, but here are some of the key resources. Jewish Personal Names by Rabbi Shmuel Gore, groups names by their roots, listing all the related names together with their variants. Unfortunately, Rabbi Gore died before the book can be completed. It was prepared for publication by his literary executor, Chaim Friedman. It's probably the best short book on Jewish given names, but the one drawback at the book does not indicate when or where particular variants were used, and a few common names are missing. There's a good book by Boris Feldblum called Russian Jewish Given Names, published in 1998, which is primarily a translation of a Russian book written by Isher Kulisher in 1911. Kulisher was a Russian government official who tried to clarify for the Russian bureaucracy the bewildering variants of Jewish given names that they found in official documents. And in the process, he reported every known name that he could find. Alfred Kolak's Dictionary of Modern and Hebrew English Names includes some brief etymologies and contains an interesting appendix where names are organized by their meaning. It's useful for modern Israeli Hebrew names, but not so much for Yiddish names. A good source for Yiddish names is Harkavy's 1928 Yiddish English Hebrew Dictionary, which was a favorite of immigrants. In an appendix, Harkavy lists Yiddish names with their Hebrew roots or variants, and some amusing English equivalents, which we'll see later. And finally, Dr. Alexander Bader's work, A Dictionary of Ashkenazic Given Names, Their Origin, Structure, Pronunciation, and Migrations, published in 2001, is surely the definitive reference work on the subject. This 725-page tome contains his 300-page PhD thesis on the evolution of Jewish given names in Eastern and Central Europe, and it concludes with a dictionary listing every Jewish first name he could find, each complete with source citations. So there are over 15,000 name variants listed, all derived from 700 different root names. On Jewish Gen, the late Dr. Jerry Esterson compiled a given names database, which you can search by Soundex to find name variants. Now, one of the biggest challenges that a genealogist faces is interpreting the names found in the records, reading the handwriting, dealing with the phonetics and spelling rules of other languages, foreign grammatical endings, and so on. Names written in Polish or Russian or any other Eastern European civil language can often be very confusing, and they're typically not spelled as a genealogist might expect. Before the 19th century, most Jews did not have hereditary family surnames. For thousands of years, Jews identified themselves only by patronymics, by their father's given names. So in Hebrew, patronymics are indicated by the word ben, meaning son of. Yaakov ben Shmuel means Yaakov the son of Shmuel, and patronymics typically appear with a Russian suffix vich for a male or ovna for a female in Russian. Now, here's a hypothetical family tree. Shlomo, his son Chaim, and Chaim's children Moshe and Leah. So Chaim is known in Hebrew as Chaim ben Shlomo, Chaim the son of Shlomo, and in Polish or Russian as Chaim Shlomovich. Shlomovich is a patronymic. It is not a surname. It is not passed to the next generation. In the next generation, Chaim's son Moshe is Moshe ben Chaim, Moshe the son of Chaim in Hebrew, or in Russian or Polish as Moshe Chaimovich, Moshe the son of Chaim. And again, Chaimovich is a patronymic, not a surname. And likewise, Leah is Leah bat Chaim or Leah Chaimovna in Polish or Russian. Now, another phenomenon we need to be aware of is the lack of the h sound, the h sound in the Russian language. There is simply no letter to represent this sound in the Cyrillic alphabet, in the Russian alphabet. In English, the H is called a voiceless glottal fricative in phonology. So foreign words that contain this sound, such as Jewish names, were either spelled with a g or a ch, the guttural ch sound instead. So a Yiddish name like Hirsch might be rendered in Russian as either Gersh or Chersh. A name like Hinda might be spelled as Chinda or Ginda. And in some Lithuanian and Ukrainian regions, the initial H tended to disappear altogether, so Hersh became Ersh, and Hinda might appear as Inda. So now let's go back to the example from the beginning of this talk. My grandfather's cousin, who was Lebka Gershkovich Dembor on his birth record, and was Mordechai Yehuda ben Tzvi on his New York tombstone. So this is an excellent example of some of the challenges of Jewish genealogical research where names are written in many languages and alphabets. In this one example, we have 5 languages and 3 alphabets. If you're afraid of foreign languages, you've picked the wrong hobby. But these are the realities of Jewish genealogical research. Now, let's walk through this example step by step. Here we see the use of patronymics. We see the Russian patronymic Ovich, son of, meaning son of, for Gershkovich, meaning son of Gersh. On the tombstone, we see the Hebrew patronymic Ben, Ben Tzvi, son of Tzvi. We see the use of unrelated double names, Mordechai and Yehuda on the tombstone. Mordechai and Yehuda are an unrelated double name pair. In some sources, only one was used. In other sources, another was used. We see the related name pair association from Yehuda to Leib. The Hebrew name Yehuda is used on the tombstone, and its Yiddish Kanui Leib, lion, is used on the civil record. We also see the use of Hebrew and Yiddish calques for the father's name. His father's name is given in Hebrew on the tombstone as Tzvi, but in the Yiddish version, they use the Yiddish calque was used in the civil record. Both Tzvi and Hirsch mean deer in Hebrew and Yiddish respectively. We see the phenomenon of the disappearing Russian H. Instead of Gersh, they use Hersh in this record. We see the use of diminutives. We see the Ka, Leib Ka and Gersh Ka, the Slavic Ka suffix as a diminutive. And finally, we have Americanization, where Mordechai becomes Max, where they basically just took the initial letter from one of the Hebrew names and picked a popular American name. Now, admittedly, this is one of the most convoluted examples I could find, but this does exemplify the types of things that you will find in your research. Some more examples for this Max Goldman. We've already seen his 1881 marriage record, Lebka Gershkovich Dembor. On his 1905 report card, he signed Max Goldman. On his tombstone, we've already seen Mordechai Yehuda ben Tzvi. A few years later, his grandson was born, who was Mordechai Leib, and they named him in English Morton Leon, very fashionable American names at that time, having the same first initial letters. And when his son Harry died in 1957, he listed his father as Ben Mordechai Arya instead of Ben Mordechai Yehuda. Yehuda and Arya are the same name. It's the Kanui lion for Yehuda. Okay, so now let's see if you've been paying attention. Here is my grandmother's ketsuva, her marriage contract from Brooklyn in 1938. If we zoom in and look at the bride's name, it says Liba Bat Reb Avraham Zeb, which means Liba, the daughter of Avraham Zeb. My name is Warren. I am named after this great-grandfather, Avraham Zeb. Does anyone know why? Sorry that I don't get the feedback here. But basically, Avraham Zev was his Hebrew name, and in everyday life, in Yiddish, he was known as Abraham Wolf, because Zev means wolf in Hebrew, and in everyday life, they use Yiddish, Wolf. Wolf and Warren have the same initial first letter, and that was good enough, so that's how I got my name, and in Hebrew, I am Wolf or Zev. Now, Polish, Russian, and other Slavic languages are highly inflected. They use declensions where the endings of nouns and adjectives change depending on how they're used in a sentence. In English, we conjugate verbs, go, goes, going, gone, went, but in Slavic and Baltic languages, they also decline nouns, including proper names such as personal names, and the endings of these words are also changed. So here's a handwritten marriage record where the groom's name looks like it's Yoskiem Wolfiem, but it's actually just Yosek Wolf. It's the instrumental case. The groom appeared with the rabbi. So in the Polish language, you have to append these funny letters at the end. You don't have to memorize these. Here's a table showing the word student in various declensions in both Russian and Polish. Generally, it's sufficient to just drop or slightly transform the endings of a name to make sense. Just be aware that these suffixes do exist, and you will see them on documents, and the names won't always appear as you might expect. So here's another example. We see the mother's name in a birth record listed as Bailey Gitli, but it's really Bela Gitla. The mother's name is the object of the preposition, therefore it needs to be in the genitive case. Therefore, you have to append all these wonderful Polish rules, which you can learn more about if you want to in an info file on Jewish Gen, which will explain all of these various Polish declensions. One more example in Baltic languages, Lithuanian and Latvian are Baltic languages, which would use even more complex declensions. Records from the period of Lithuanian independence between the two world wars were written in the Lithuanian language. And in Lithuanian and Latvian, even the nominative case, the subject receives an ending. So here's a portion of my great-grandmother's brother's birth registration recorded in Alytus in July or June of 1939. The record gives his name as Abromas Moshias Sinus Israelio Bermano, which to me sounds Latin or Italian, but the AS and the IS are just nominative suffixes in Lithuanian, so it really just says Abra Moshe, the son of Israel Berman. Here's a 1938 Lithuanian phone book, which lists last names such as Bermanis, Davidzonas, Flaxmanis, Freidas, which are really just Berman, Bialystocki, Davidson, Flaxman, and Fried, but they do put the nominative endings on even the names. Now, you should not interpret too literally any information that's written in any single document, especially if that information was given orally by the informant to another person who wrote down what he or she heard. If the information was given orally, the writer wrote what he heard in his language. Now, you can't hear the document, you can only see the document. Therefore, you need, in order to interpret the document, you need to keep in mind the person who wrote the document as well as the informant. You need to see the document through the ears of the person who wrote it. Now, here are a few examples of this. Here's a 1900 US federal census for Chelsea, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. And a Jewish family is listed with a daughter with the name of Bloomer, B-L-O-O-M-E-R. Well, if you write with a Boston accent, in which the name Peter is written P-E-T-E-R, then the name pronounced Bluma must be written B-L-O-O-M-E-R. Not being familiar with Jewish names, the census taker wrote what he heard in his language. You need to see the document through the ears of the person who wrote it. Here's another example, also from the 1900 U.S. Census of Chelsea. The daughter was listed as Solit, S-O-L-I-T. We couldn't figure this one out until we found other documents that this girl's name was Charlotte. And the census taker probably just couldn't understand what the mother was saying. And here's one last example from St. Louis, Missouri. The census taker listed a son with the name I-M-A-N. What do you think this name is? It's further research determined that the name was Hyman, which he wrote down as Iman. So the census taker wrote down what he heard. So for documents like the U.S. Census, where the information was given orally, you need to interpret what you see and try to put yourselves in the mind of the individual who wrote it down, as well as the informant. Now, if the information was given in written form, there's a question of the interpretation of the writer's handwriting. You have to bear in mind the principal language of the transcriber or writer or copyist. Now, here's a selection of letters which can easily be confused when handwritten. And capital letters can be confused even more easily if they're written ornately. A lot of the transcribed online American databases, such as the Ellis Island database, are notorious for these types of errors. The transcribers were not familiar with European names and place names, so they just wrote down what they thought they saw, and the results are sometimes pretty funny. Now, spelling doesn't matter. Consistent spelling is a 20th century invention and obsession, and spelling was never important in earlier times. There's no one correct way to spell most Jewish names in Latin letters because of transliteration. I mean, how many ways are there to spell Hanukkah in English? It's not an English word, and therefore there's no correct English spelling. There is a correct spelling in Hebrew, but not in English. Now, most passenger manifests were filled out by German or Dutch clerks, and therefore they use German or Dutch spelling phonetics. Beginner genealogists often look for only exact spelling, and when they do, they usually don't find what they're looking for. So you have to be very open-minded with the spelling of the names of your ancestors in your research. You may have already looked at the records of your ancestors, but just didn't realize it. Now, here's a list of similar sounding consonants which can easily be interchanged. So Shepsel might become Shepsel, or Mordcha might become Mordcha, because these letters sound very similar. Now, here's another set of consonants to keep in mind if you're looking at a document that's been translated from Hebrew or Yiddish. These are Hebrew or Yiddish letters that look very similar but can have different sounds. Now, you also need to ask yourself how a certain sound may have been represented in the language of the person writing the document. For example, in English, we use the letters SH for a certain sound, sh, but in German, the sh sound is represented with the letters SCH, or just by an S followed by a T or a P. The same sound is represented different ways in Polish, either by the letters SZ, SI, or the S with the kreska accent mark. In Lithuanian and Czech, it's the S hechek that is the sh sound. In Hungarian, the S all by itself is the sh sound, as in Budapest. In Romanian, it's the S comma. In Italian, it's the letters SC followed by an I or an E that are the sh sound. In French and Portuguese, it's the letters CH, as in chef, and Hebrew, Yiddish, and Russian, of course, have their own alphabets. So for an example, a ship clerk on a German ship probably wrote the name of a Lithuanian Jewish immigrant named Shana as S-C-H-E-I-N-E, while a clerk on a Polish ship might write it as S-Z-E-J-N-A, and a French clerk might write it as C-H-E accent aigu N-A. So again, when interpreting written documents, you need to keep in mind the linguistic background of the person who wrote the document. Here's one more example that stuck me for quite a while. On a Yad Vashem page of testimony, I found that someone had written the victim's father's name as C-H-A-I-A. I mean, what is that name? C-H-A-I-A to me spells Chaya, which is a female name. But only when I realized that the survivor was living in Brazil did I figure it out. In Brazil, they speak Portuguese, and in Portuguese, the letters CH have the sh sound. Therefore, the name he's trying to write is Shaya, Ishaya, Isaiah. was the father's name that he was trying to write. So again, when interpreting written documents, always keep in mind the linguistic background of the person who wrote the document. Now, immigrant ship manifests are extremely valuable sources for most American Jewish genealogists. It's important to remember that these lists were compiled before the ship landed. Thus, these lists will contain the European pre-Americanized names. You're not going to find any Jewish Jennies or Harrys on these ships. Those are American names. For Jews from Eastern Europe, the names used on the passenger manifest will be the secular vernacular Yiddish names. And the names were written down the way that they sounded in the phonetics of the language of the shipping company. Now, one often hears that the name was changed at Ellis Island. Well, no, it wasn't. Despite the popular myth and a bunch of good jokes, many, if not most, Jewish immigrants to the United States and to Israel or Latin America and elsewhere did eventually change both their given names and surnames, but this came later as part of the assimilation process. They adopted new names after they began working or started school, and often it wasn't even the immigrant who invented their own name. It might have been an Italian coworker or an Irish school teacher who suggested a new name for them. Now, moreover, it can't be repeated too often that there are no fixed English equivalents for any immigrant Hebrew or Yiddish names. Immigrants were free to choose any new name they wanted. There were no rules or regulations. Let me skip over this one. Here's a quote from Mary Anton, a Boston novelist who describes how she was taken shopping soon after arriving. She writes, "With our despised immigrant clothing, we shed also our impossible Hebrew names. A committee of our friends, several years ahead of us in American experience, put their heads together and concocted American names for us all. Those of our real names that had no pleasing American equivalents, they ruthlessly discarded, content if they retained the initials." So most immigrants did change their first name, usually to something that started with the same first letter. So someone who was named Moshe or Mendel or Mordechai or Menachem or Meyer in the old country might take an American name, Max or Morris or Marvin or Milton or Murray or Mel, whatever was fashionable at the time. Again, there are no rules regarding these transformations. The names don't translate or mean anything. People were free to choose whatever name seemed fashionable. Now, unfortunately, these name changes were not officially recorded for the most part. The best way to determine an immigrant ancestor's European given name is to check the Hebrew inscription on their tombstone. From the Hebrew name, you can more easily derive the possible Yiddish names. Now, these name transformations are not translations. There's no linguistic or onomastic term for this, so I'm going to call them adaptations. Now, some names have actual language equivalents in various languages, all from the same root. An example here is the biblical Hebrew name Yosef. Most biblical names will have versions in every Western language because Western Christian nations have the same basic cultural roots. The biblical names came to them from Hebrew through Greek and Latin, finally to their own native version. So the Hebrew name Yosef is Yosef in German and Czech, and Yosef in French, Jose in Spanish, in Giuseppe in Italian, and so on. Now, here's a gross oversimplification of the historical sources of names. You have two cultures, the Jewish tradition and the Greek and Roman tradition. And Western European culture is kind of a merger of the two, with Christianity using names from biblical Hebrew. However, there are no equivalent versions of most post-biblical Jewish names in European languages. There's no English version of Nachman or Fruma. A common question that used to be asked on Jewish Gen is, my great-grandfather's name was Menachem. What's that in English? Well, like I say, it could be anything that starts with M that was fashionable. And the same thing is true in reverse. There is no Hebrew or Yiddish version of George or Herman because these names come from Greek and German roots, respectively. There's no common biblical Hebrew root to go back to, so there simply isn't any equivalent. So those were but right here are English language versions of Hebrew names. These are not translations, they're cognates. So Moshe in Hebrew is Moses in English. Yechezkel in Hebrew is Ezekiel in English. Now, if one of these English names was considered fashionable, like Abraham or Moses or Jacob, the immigrant might take that name if they were named Abraham or Yaakov or Moshe. But you didn't see a lot of immigrants take the name Ezekiel or Phineas if they were named Yechezkel or Pinchas. They chose something that was much more common and acceptable at that point in time. So as we said, there are no English language equivalents of non-biblical Hebrew names. Now, Alexander Harkavy's 1928 Yiddish English Hebrew Dictionary contains some suggested translative equivalents for Jewish immigrants seeking new American names. Most of Harkavy's suggestions were calques, borrowings based on the underlying meaning of a name from Hebrew or Yiddish into Greek or Latin. Apparently, not many immigrants took to his suggestions, preferring instead to imitate the name of their American-born neighbors. So what names did they choose? Many years ago, I did a study of the empirical evidence on Jewish tombstones, which contained both Hebrew and English names. I collected data from 6,000 tombstones in several early 20th century Landsmannschaft cemeteries in New York and Boston. So we see for those with the Hebrew Aharon, 48% chose the name Aaron, which is the English language equivalent, but 20% became Harry, 8% became Arthur, and 20% chose some other name. Of those with the Hebrew name Arya, 70% became Lewis. Why? Because Arya is Hebrew for lion, and in Yiddish they were known as Leib. Leib and Lewis have the first letter. Avigdor, of those with the Hebrew name Avigdor, 83% became Victor. Why? Because the Yiddish version of Avigdor is Vigdor. Vigdor and Victor sound very similar. Of those with the Hebrew name Abraham, 77% chose the English language version, and others gave other names. And here are a few more examples of the Hebrew to English name adaptations based on tombstone data. For the name Chaya, 58% became Ida. I think this is just because of assonance, because of the similar of the vowel sounds, Aya, Chaya, Ida. And you should note that the New English name could be based upon either of their Hebrew names if they had a double name. Now, here are some adaptations going the other way. We're going to skip a few of these since we don't have a lot of time. Charles is an interesting case. 20% became Betzalel or were Betzalel. 20% were Chetzkel or Yechezkel, and many other names. I think one of the reasons for Betzalel is the Yiddish nickname for Tzalel is Tzali, and Tzali sounds a lot like Charlie, the English nickname for Charles. You should note in some of the above cases, the Yiddish diminutive name is the one that's used for, such as Shaya for Yehoshua or Srul for Yisrael, has the same initial sound or letter of the New American name. So here's how I classify these Hebrew to English adaptations. You can either choose the linguistic equivalent name. That's only if both names have a Hebrew source. So Yaakov becomes Jacob and so on. The second category is translation, where the names go back to words in different languages with similar meanings. So Pearl becomes Margaret, Bluma becomes Flora, Chaya becomes Vivian, and so on. These cases were very rare. The most common category was phonetic similarity. The names look similar or look similar in writing, and usually just the beginnings of the names coincide, no more than the first sound. And those were the vast majority. And the fourth category, I couldn't find any connection. The immigrant chose a new name that had absolutely nothing to do with their Hebrew or Yiddish name. Yitzchak became Fred, Rivka Leah became Augusta, and so on. So each Jewish immigrant basically has three names: the original Hebrew name, the Shem HaKodesh, the original Yiddish name, the European secular name, and the New English name, the American secular name. For genealogical purposes, we're interested in determining B, the secular Yiddish given name, because that's the name that the genealogist must know in order to find official records of previous generations in the old country. For immigrants to the U.S., it's the passenger arrival manifests that are the best source of the Yiddish name, since they were filled out before immigration. So a few examples. My grandfather, his Shem HaKodesh was Yitzchak. On his birth registration, it was written in Russian as Itzik. When he immigrated to the U.S. as Itzko, which is a Polish diminutive of Itzhak, but the numbnuts who transcribed the Ellis Island database misread the typed I as a capital T, so it was transcribed as TCKO, so it took me many, many years to find it. He was called Jack by his co-workers, probably because they couldn't pronounce Yitzchak. He was known as Izzy among his family. He was naturalized as Isidore. In the 1930 census, he was listed as Jacob, probably because a neighbor knew him as Jack, so assumed it was Jacob. And despite the fact that the English version of the Hebrew name Yitzchak is Isaac, he was never Isaac. So which one is his real name? They all are. There's no such thing as a real name. A name is what people call you. Often the name on some official document or birth record is one that you never used during your lifetime. On my family tree and JGSGO files, I usually put the name that they had for the majority of their life and don't formalize it. I say Abe or Abi instead of Abraham, and I use custom fields to list their religious Hebrew name and for who they were named for, who they were named after. Let's see, I don't know how much time you want to spend here, but the same principles of immigrants to America applied to immigrants to other countries. Here are some examples of Jewish immigrants to Latin America and what Spanish names they chose. So for females, Sora might become Sarah, Susana, Sonia, Sandra, or Sabrina in Spanish. Malka might become Maria, Monica, Margarita, or Reina in Spanish. Malka means queen in Hebrew, Reina means queen in Spanish. So usually they just have the same initial sound, but sometimes they translate the underlying meaning. And also name trends vary with the times, with generation to generation. An immigrant who came in the 1920s who was named Moshe might become Moises, where in the 1920s it was much more likely that he would become Mauricio, in the 1940s, Mario, and so on. And we'll see the same examples in America in a little while. Here's the same pattern for Soviet adaptations. When Jews assimilated in the Soviet Union, they would typically choose a Russian language version of the biblical name, or a name that has the same first letter or sound, or just a name that sounds similar in general. So I'm going to finish up with some popularity statistics. Here are the most popular given names from the city of Lomża, located in northeastern Poland. This analysis is based on a study of 13,000 Jewish birth records recorded in Lomża 1827 to 1886, as extracted from the civil records by Michael Tobias. In the following chart, Polish spellings are used. All variants of each name have been grouped, and double names like Sora Rivka have been counted twice, once under each name. So in Lomża, we see that Abram was the most popular name for males, and Sora was the most popular name for females. The biblical patriarchs and matriarchs topped the lists. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, recorded in the civil records in their Yiddish versions of Abram, Yitzchak, and Yankel. And Sora, Rachel, Leah, and Rivka are all within the top 5 positions. For females, we see that purely Yiddish names often occurred, such as Fega, Shana, Gittel, Bela, and Liba. Here's another set of statistics, this time from the Polish town of Chęcin in Kielce Górne, about 200 miles from our previous example in Lomża. And we see that the given name distribution is fairly similar to Lomża. A few names have moved up or down a few positions in popularity. For example, the names Moshe and Hirsch were the most popular in Chęcin. And here's a side-by-side comparison of the female name distribution in Lomża and Chęcin, repeated from previous slides. Now, here's another set of given name distribution statistics from the 1991 Tel Aviv phone book English edition. It's 100 years later and 1,000 miles away from our previous example. But in comparing the two sets of data, Tel Aviv 1991 with Lomża in the 19th century, a Of the top 20 male names in Lumja in the 19th century, 14 of them were still in the top 20 in Israel in 1991, many of them in similar positions. Of the remaining 6 names, 2 were transformed from Yiddish to Hebrew, Leib to Yehuda, and Hersh to Tzvi. 4 Yiddish names dropped out, Ber, Wolf, Laser, and Zelman, to be replaced by the Hebrew names Shimon, Benjamin, Menachem, and Michael. And I guess the name distributions remain pretty similar over time because of the Jewish naming traditions, where children are named after recently deceased relatives. So the name distribution remains very much the same, even over centuries. Now, the given names used by American Jews have changed over the generation, often to reflect popular culture. Shown here are some of the more popular given names used in 4 successive generations. Ironically, while many Americans think of Irving, Morris, Sidney, and Sheldon as stereotypical Jewish names, they're really nothing of the sort. There's nothing Jewish at all about these names. They're Anglo-Saxon names that were popular 100 years ago. And they were used by Jews precisely because they didn't want to sound Jewish. So here are names that were popular among Jews in the immigrant generation in the 19-teens. For females, Anna, Becky, Bessie, Bertha, Clara, Celia, Dora, Etter, Esther. For men, Abe, Ben, Charles, David, Harry, Herman, Hyman, Irving, Isaac, and so on. In the next generation, the second generation, common names for females were Alice, Arlene, Beatrice, Bernice, Betty, Blanche, Claire, Doris, Dorothy, Edith, and for men, Alfred, Arnold, Arthur, Bernard, Charles, Edward, George, and so on. In the 1950s, names like Anne, Barbara, Beth, Bonnie, Carol, and Cheryl became popular for girls, and for boys, names like Alan, Andrew, Barry, Bruce, Donald, Eric, and Gary. Now, some of these names come from popular culture. Shirley was popular in the 1930s because of Shirley Temple. Grace in the 1950s because of Grace Kelly. In the generation of the 1970s, names like Amy, Brandy, Carrie, Cindy, Dana, Dawn, and Denise became popular for females. And for men, names like Adam, Bradley, Brian, Darren, Eric, Evan, and Jason. The name Monica throughout the 1980s and 90s was in the top 20 for baby girls, but at the end of the Clinton administration, it dropped to number 784. So again, we see how popular culture can influence given name selections. In the 21st century, in the last few years, popular names that are coming back are Max, Sophie, Jacob, Sarah, Sam, Henry, Molly, Aaron. There are all these kids running around with the names of my great-grandparents. So who knows what names might come back into vogue. Now, all the slides from this presentation are available on the Jewish Gen website. If we have time, I can take a few questions.
Wow, that was amazing. Okay. I'm hearing, can you hear all the excellence, Warren? Anyway, we've got a few questions. Let's take no more than, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes of questions and a 5-minute break. And then if you can give us just a piece of your surname talk would be amazing. Okay, Maureen? How did Alexander become Sasha?
That's a good question. That is a Russian variant, as far as I know. That has nothing to do with
that's just traditional Russian
or Yiddish.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And that's just from the Russian. It just always evolved that way. It has nothing to do with anything here. Anyone else? Questions? Okay, we'll take a 5-minute break. So 8:32, we'll come back.
Okay.
I'm going to pause the recording. Oh, I'm also, wait, before you go, Warren, I'm going to see if there were any questions from the internet folks. Yeah?
Can we get his address so I know where to send this thing?
I think you can get it off the Jewish Gen website.
Do you want me just to send it there?
Yeah. Warren?
Yes.
The honorarium just to the Jewish Gen address on the website?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. I don't see any questions from the attendees online. But I do. Go to questions page. Why is the questions page is not opening? Ah, here we go. Okay. Okay, so no questions from the remote folks. Yeah? However, okay. All right. Hit it.
Okay, so this next lecture is on Jewish surnames or last names. I was always very reluctant to give this talk because I'm going to tell you some things you don't want to hear. So the introductory, the agenda for this talk, we're talking about the mythology associated with Jewish surnames, the history of surnames, the different classifications, sources where you can learn about your surnames, how to interpret the names you find in records, some of the Americanization process, and then conclude with some demographics and statistics. Now, there are many myths associated with Jewish surnames. Number one is that there are distinctly Jewish surnames, when the truth is that people are Jewish, names aren't Jewish. Myth number two is that everyone with the same surname is related. And the truth is that surnames develop independently in multiple locations. So most people with your surname are not related to you, and most people related to you don't have your surname. Myth number three, names were changed at Ellis Island. The truth is this never happened. And myth number four is that surnames are meaningful. And the truth is most surnames were assigned or taken rather arbitrarily. And if you learn the meaning of your surname, you won't probably discover anything mystical about yourself. But for some reason that escapes me, people are obsessed and fascinated with surnames. Some people think that genealogy is all about names, and genealogy is not about surnames. Genealogy is about people. In doing genealogical research, you trace people, you don't trace surnames. So there's not much in a name, and you shouldn't be obsessed with them, and Jews were far less attached to their surnames than other people. Now, like given names, this is a very big subject. There have been hundreds of books and articles written about it, but I will try to give you a very brief summary. The history of Jewish surnames is a rather short history. Most Jews have had hereditary family names for less than 200 years. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses in the Bible didn't have last names, and neither did your great-great-great-grandfather. Before that, people were referred to by patronymic, their father's given name, using the Hebrew word ben, which means son of. Now, we've already seen this from the previous lecture, so I really won't go over it again, but Shlomo's son Chaim is Chaim ben Shlomo in Hebrew and Chaim Shlomovich in Polish or Russian. Shlomovitz is not a surname, it is a patronymic. It does not go from generation to generation. Patronymics in Hebrew are ben or bat. In Russian or Polish, it's ovich and ovna. And here are the suffixes in Romanian and Hungarian. Now, the earliest use of surnames by Jews was in the ghetto of Frankfurt am Main in Germany. In the Judengasse, the Jews' lane in the 17th century, the houses weren't numbered until 1761. And because people were illiterate, the houses were identified by house signs, graphical symbols, which were shown pictorially on painted signs, which were hung in front of every house on the Judengasse, on inns, on taverns, on places of business, and so on. There were about 200 different signs. And here are a few examples. The Adler, which means eagle, Apfelbaum means apple tree, Birnbaum means pear tree, and so on. Now, eventually, some of these symbols were also carved on the gravestones of the house owners. So the people who lived in a certain house began to be known by their house sign name, and it became sort of a surname. But if they moved from one house to another house on the Judengasse, then they took the name of the new house. So these surnames weren't strictly hereditary. Now, governments started imposing mandates requiring Jews to take fixed hereditary surnames so that they could tax them and draft them. Austria was the first nation to have compulsory surnames for Jews under the Emperor Joseph II in 1787. In the Napoleonic Empire, it was 1808. And here are the dates for various other parts of Eastern Europe. In Romania, Jews did not need surnames until the 1870s, and in Turkey, not until 1934. So like I say, Jewish surnames is a rather short history. Now, many Jews resisted these changes. They saw it as part of assimilation and a dissolution of their lifestyle, and they only used these names when they had business with official government clerks. They didn't use them amongst themselves. You typically will not see a surname on a Jewish tombstone in Eastern Europe until the 20th century, only the patronymic. Now, it's very difficult to generalize how these names were imposed. It varied greatly from place to place. Every duchy and principality and town implemented things their own way. Usually the Jews could pick their own surnames with official approval. As I said before, most names were devoid of meaning. The Jews really didn't take this too seriously. It's like in kindergarten when, you be the lions, you be the tigers, you be the bears, let's play a game. They didn't think these names would stick. Various brothers could take different surnames, and two unrelated families with the same occupation might take the same surname. A lot of this has to do with the history of Eastern Europe. I have a bunch of great slides here on the history of border changes in Eastern Europe, which I will just whiz through because we don't have a lot of time. But basically, the borders changed greatly after World War I and World War II. And then finally today, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, we have a map that looks very different than the map of Europe when our ancestors originally had their given names about 200 years ago. I want to emphasize that there is no such thing as a Jewish surname. You cannot tell someone's religion based solely upon their surname. Names that sound Jewish to you sound Jewish only because of an association in a certain place and time. A typical Jewish surname in America is not a typical Jewish surname in Israel or in 19th century Poland. Alexander Bader's study of Jewish surnames in the Kingdom of Poland found that 40% of all surnames were used by both Jews and Christians. Now, most surnames can be classified into one of several different types: patronymics, toponymics, occupational, personal characteristics, artificial, Kohen, Levite, and acronyms. A patronymic surname is one that's based on a father's given name. It was chosen to honor your father. The Slavic suffixes ovich or off, or the Germanic suffix son, typically indicate a patronymic surname. Abramowitz means son of Abram, Moskowitz, son of Moshe, Hershkovitz, son of Hirsch, Manischewitz, son of Menashe, Mendelssohn, son of Mendel. You could also choose a surname to honor your mother. Surnames that end with in or kin or kind are typically metronymic surnames. Sirkin means descendant of Sarah, Chaikin from Chaya, Rifkin from Rivka, Shifrin from Shifra, Scheindlin from Schendel, Dvorkin from Dvora, Lakin from Leah, Fagin from Fega, and so on. Also, names that end with es are often metronymics, and the suffix man can mean husband of. So Esterman means husband of Esther, Rochman means husband of Rocha, Perlman, husband of Pearl, and so on, are other ways of forming metronymic surnames. A toponymic surname is one that's named after the place of origin. The Slavic suffix ski or the Germanic suffix er typically indicates a toponymic surname. Warshawski means someone from Warska, Brodsky can mean someone from Brody, Berliner, someone from Berlin, Vilner, someone from Vilna. An occupational surname is one based upon your occupation, on your job. So you could choose your job name in Yiddish. A Becker is a baker, a Farber is a painter, a Fleischer is a butcher, and so on. A lot of Yiddish names that end with man are also occupational names. Ackerman is farmer, Dorfman, man from the village, Eisenman, Iron Man, and so on. And here are some occupation names in Polish. You might have chosen an occupation name in the Polish language to form your surname. Alexander Beider's study shows that of the occupational surnames, about 60% were based on German or Yiddish roots, about 35% were based on Slavic roots, and 5% were based on Hebrew language roots. Another category of surnames are personal characteristics, either a physical feature or your character or a family relationship or your place of residence might be used as a source of a surname. Artificial surnames are a major category of surnames. And before I talk about artificial surnames, I also want to talk about artificial versus organic street names. In the little town that I lived in New England, there was a street named Main Street. They called it that because it was the main street in town. There was a street called River Street. That's because it was a street that ran by the river. Lexington Street was the street that ran to the town of Lexington. Concord Ave was the street that ran to Concord. Bridge Street was the street with the bridge on it over the Charles River. Bishop's Forest Drive was the drive owned through the forest, owned by the family named Bishop. And South Street was the street heading south out of town. So all these names are rather organic and they have meaning. Now, when I moved to the development I currently live in California, the street names in our developments are Forester Court, Ranch Creek Court, Wild Rose Court, Canyon Breeze Court. There are no Foresters on Forester Court. There's no ranches or no creek on Ranch Creek Court. There aren't any roses on Wild Rose Court. The breezes aren't any different on Canyon Breeze Court. These are all artificial names that were assigned arbitrarily all at one time with very little meaning. And the same thing is true of artificial surnames, which are ornamental or fanciful surnames. Some artificial surnames are named after animals, some after plants, some after food items, some after gems or metals, and some are titles. Now, the most stereotypical Jewish surname is what we call an artificial compound surname, where the first part is the name of a precious metal or gem, such as gold, pearl, or silver. Or it could be an adjective denoting beauty, such as fine or shine. It could be one of the colors in Yiddish. It could be the name of a flower or tree, or it could be a heavenly object or a mineral, such as iron, copper, or salt, or a size. Klein means small, gross means big. And that's the typical first part. The typical second part might be a topographic term, such as berg, which means mountain, feld means field, stein means stone, tal means valley, and so on, or a part of a plant, such as a baum meaning tree, blatt meaning leaf, bloom meaning flower, garten meaning garden, holz meaning wood, zweig meaning branch, or some other miscellaneous terms were also used as the compound part. So basically you have two parts of the surnames. You take one from column A, one from column B, and you can create a whole boatload of Jewish surnames just like that. Here are just a few examples of real Jewish surnames that were found in the Russian Empire in Alexander Beider's book. Rosenbach, Rosenband, Rosenbar, Rosenbarg, Rosenbaum, Rosenbein, Rosenberg, and so on. So these are your stereotypical artificial compound surnames. Beider's also did, because he's a mathematician, did some statistical analysis of various districts around Poland. And so if you have a very unusual name, sometimes you can use Beider statistics to tell what part of Poland your name might have come from. Now, another category that's unique to Jews are Kohen and Levitic surnames, based upon what tribe you came from, going way back on the priestly origin. Kohen, a descendant of Aaron, names like Kagan or Khan or Cohn, spelled in any number of ways, or Kaplan or Katz are Kohanic surnames. And names like Levi, 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 Levin, Levitz, Levita are Levitic surnames. And finally, another unique Jewish way of forming a surname is with an acronym, where you take the first letter of a bunch of words and put them together to form another word. The names of many Jewish scholars were acronyms. Rashi is Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak. You take the first letter of each of his names, you put them together, and it forms an acronym. Same with Rambam, Rabbi Moshe Ben Maimon, RMBM, Rambam. So many surnames are also formed from Hebrew acronyms. Katz is a Kohanic acronym. Siegel is a Levitic acronym. There are other occupations that are acronyms. You could be named after a Jewish scholar, or some other surnames are also based on the first letter of multiple Hebrew words. Another category are what we call rabbinic surnames. Here's an exhaustive list of 35 rabbinic families, many of which can also be classified as one of the previous types, but they're listed here for historical reasons. Many of them were used for a few centuries before the surname edicts. If you have one of these rabbinic surnames, you might want to check out Neil Rosenstein's Unbroken Chain or Jewish Gen's Ravsig. Now, some sources where you can learn about your surname include Benzion Kaganov's Dictionary of Jewish Names and Their History, which is a highly readable layman's work, but is error-prone and has no references given. Alexander Bader's surnames dictionaries are really the key volumes. He has one volume for the Russian Empire, one for the Kingdom of Poland, and one for Galicia. Because these books are so important, I'm going to show an example of how to read an entry in one of Bader's dictionary. He shows the surname in bold, the location in parentheses, he lists the type, and then he lists his hypothesis of what the etymology is. He lists the suffix that a surname might use in angle brackets, and then in curly brackets, he lists the related surnames. So, for example, a surname like Bozhnitsky was found in the Płotsk and Sochachev regions of Poland. It's an occupational name from the Polish word Bożnica, which means synagogue. It uses the suffix ski, and Buzhnitsky, Biznitz, and Buzhnitsk are related surnames, and those that are surnames that are related etymologically, not genealogically. The surname Kromalowski was found in the Linshins, Częstochow, Bendin, and Warsaw district. It's a toponym from the town of Kromolov in the Olkusz district, and he lists 4 surnames that are etymologically related. And here are the etymology codes that Bader uses in his book. I'm sure that your JGS has a copy of Bader's dictionaries that you can use to look up your surnames. There are similar books for other regions. There's a dictionary of German Jewish surnames by Lars Menk, and a dictionary of Hispanic surnames, Sephardic surnames by Guillermo Feigenbaum. Alexander Bader just came out this week with a new book, a 700-page book on Jewish surnames from North Africa. A great book for Polish surnames, both Jewish and non-Jewish, is this book by William Hoffman. It's now, there's a 3rd edition. There's a very big book by the Guggenheimers, which isn't really worth its salt. It has a lot of bad reviews. Alexander Bader edited the chapters on Jewish names in the 3-volume Oxford Dictionary of American Family Names. And there are many other names, bibliographies, or lists of books about names. All of these can be found in the bibliography in your handout. Online, there's the Jewish Gen Family Finder, which contains over 100,000 Jewish surnames actively being researched by Jewish genealogists worldwide. And on the Avotenu website, there's the CJSI, the Consolidated Jewish Surname Index, which lists 700,000 different surnames found in 42 different online databases. Now, spelling doesn't matter. Spelling doesn't matter. Spelling doesn't matter. I can't repeat this enough. The most frustrating experiences that I've had in trying to teach genealogical research is the stubbornness of those who insist that Grandpa always spelled his name one way and only that way. Since the Exodus from Egypt, our family has always spelled their name with 2 T's. The one with 1 T can't possibly be related to us. And the truth is that consistent spelling is a 20th century invention and obsession. Names were never spelled consistently in earlier times. No one spelling is no more correct than any other. And like I said in the Given Names talk, beginning genealogists frequently look only for exact spelling, and they usually don't find what they're looking for. So you need to be very open-minded with the spelling of names in your research. The name that you might spell as Goldstein will be spelled in Russian records like this and in Yiddish records like that. So of course they didn't spell the names consistently. Here are 50 different ways that the surname Eisenberg has been recorded in various Jewish gen databases. Here's 150 different ways that the surname Lipschitz has been recorded in Jewish gen databases. Now, thanks to the beauty of Mokotov Soundex, names are encoded in these databases by the way that they sound rather than only by the way that they're spelled. So no matter how you spell Auerbach or Lipschitz or Schlamovitz, when searching Jewish gen databases, all of the related spellings or sounds will be listed together. We'll skip through a few of these since we covered these in the given names talk. Americanization. One often hears that the name was changed in Ellis Island. No, it was not. Despite the humorous stories and good jokes, it's a very popular, but it is an urban legend. It never happened. Many Jewish immigrants to the U.S. did eventually change their given names and surnames, but that happened later as part of the assimilation process. New names were often self-imposed to their foreignness when they started working or when children started school or upon gaining citizenship. The names were not changed at Ellis Island. The names were Americanized by a shortening or translation or other types of transformation. In my family, the original Polish name was Blatita. It was shortened to Blatt. Kleinbortz became Kleinberg in America. Chapnik became Ch in America. Mamroth became Goldman in America. His neighbor Denber also became Goldman in America. Gruszkiewicz became Greenberg. Garbovich became Rosenberg. And Lozdejski became Silverman. So here you see typical Polish Jewish surnames on the left side and typical American Jewish surnames on the right side. So these American surnames, either they just used a simple spelling change, or they Germanicized or Anglicized part of it, they truncated it, or had a complete transformation. And here are examples of each. The English American surname Finkelstein was Finkelstein in Polish. Katz would be spelled K-A-C in Polish because the letter C has the S sound in Polish. Schwartz would be spelled like this in Poland. Silver would be spelled Zilber in Poland. Zimmerman is spelled Zimmerman in Poland. And here are a few even more bizarre examples of Polish spellings which were greatly simplified in America. Another way of transforming was simply to take some of the more Yiddish or Slavic elements and make them more German or American. Boehm became Baum, Stein became Stein, Witsch became Witz. You could also truncate your name by just chopping off a few syllables. And then, of course, there's the complete transformation. You don't want a Jewish name like Garbowitz, you want a nice American name like Rosenberg. Now, here's an example from my wife's family. The name in Opochno, Poland was Sobowiński. When they came to America, some people transformed the spelling with a Y. Some people changed the W to a V. The branch that went to England changed their surnames to Levy and Levy because they were Levites and Sobowiński was a mouthful. In the subsequent generation in America, the Sobowińskis became Sobin or Bowen, and one branch just changed their name to Stevens. And the British branch is now Leighton. I'd like to read you a brief excerpt from a book called The Language of Names by Justin Kaplan and Ann Bernays. It says, by the 1930s, there were so many newly hatched Coopers, Gordons, Kings, and Davises, Livingstons and Newmans, Gladstones and Harrises, that these names became recognizably Jewish, certainly to Jews. They were self-defeating so far as their original purpose to mask or assimilate Jewish identity was concerned. Now, the most celebrated of a rearguard action pitted a Philadelphia man, Harry H. Kabachnik, who in 1923 petitioned the court for permission to shorten his name to Cabot against an army of outraged blue bloods. Kabachnik's suit faced opposition from many, including the Historical Order of Pennsylvania, and many genuine Cabots, representatives of what was universally or New Englandly acknowledged to be the first of Boston's first families, which made them so lofty, as the Banquet Post of the time put it, that the Lowells talked only to the Cabots and the Cabots talked only to God. Now, Kabachnik and his wife Myrtle argued that the name they wanted to change was cumbersome, a hardship, and an inconvenience. In allowing their petition, the judge of the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas argued that the change was an acceptable example of normalization and that these new Cabots had no intention of wanting to pass themselves as old ones. The affair stirred up considerable attention and thoughtful comment. A New York Times editorial suggested that the Cabots might have better followed the example of several medieval lords of the manor who permitted or even encouraged peasants to borrow their lofty names. An editorial in the newspaper The American Hebrew deplored the loss of Kabachnik with its rich, sneezing tonal effects. But the most enduring comment, however, parodied the familiar toast. And this is good old Boston, the home of the bean and the cod, where the Lowells have no one to talk to, since the Cabots speak Yiddish, my God. Now, here are a few popularity statistics, which we'll just breeze through here. The most common Jewish surnames in the US are Cohn, Miller, Schwartz, Friedman, Levine, Kaplan, and so on, as you can see here on this slide. This is by a study by the American Cancer Society in 1982. Here's the same statistics looked at from a different skew. Of those with the surname Goldberg, 95% identified as Jewish, 95% of Goldsteins identified as Jewish, and so on. But as you continue down the list, those with the surname Levi, only 80% identified themselves as Jewish. Of those with the surname Feldman, 76% said they were Jewish. Of those with the surname Stern, only 73% Jewish. Of Schwartz, 54% Jewish. Stein, 53% Jewish. Weiss, 38% Jewish. Klein, 34% Jewish. Gordon, 16% Jewish. And Miller, 5% Jewish. So even though Miller was the second most common Jewish surname in America, only 5% of those with the surname Miller are Jewish. Now, here are the most common surnames in the Russian Empire from Alexander Beider's work based on early 20th century Duma voters lists. So we wouldn't call some of these very common Jewish surnames today. Here are the 40 most common surnames in Israel from the Israeli Ministry of Population in 1979. This includes Arab names, 16%, and Sephardic names as well. You can see that among Sephardim, there are many given names that are used as surnames, such as number 4, Peretz, number 6, Avraham, number 10, Yosef, number 12, David, number 23, Moshe, number 29, Yaakov, and so on. And there are other Sephardic names on this list, such as number 3, Mizrahi, which means Easterner, number 5, Biton, which means life in Ladino, number 8, Dahan, which means house painter or oil merchant in Arabic, and so on. So if we compare the most common surnames in the United States with common surnames in Israel, we see that Cohn is number 1 in both places, but Miller is number 2 in the US and doesn't even make the top 100 in Israel. So Israeli surnames have been transformed just as American surnames have. When immigrants, Zionists came to Israel, they often chose new names. Some of them were a direct translation of the name that they used in the diaspora, or they might have chosen a name that had a phonetic similarity with a Hebrew word or a completely new symbolic surname. Some people kept their old names because they were traditional or religious surnames, or it had a prominent yichus status to it, or the name already was from the Hebrew language. So here are some examples of Israeli surnames which are a direct translation of the underlying meaning of the surname they had in the diaspora. Goldberg, translated into Hebrew, is Har Paz. Steinberg is Har Even. Rosenstein is Even Shushan, and so on. Another way of forming an Israeli name was simply to find a phonetic similarity with a Hebrew word. Other Israelis, often Holocaust survivors, chose completely new symbolic names. And those that kept their names were often those that had traditional or religious surnames, or surnames that had some prominence associated with them, or surnames that were already based on the Hebrew language. Here are the original surnames of the first 12 Israeli prime ministers. David Ben-Gurion's original name was Grin in Poland. Moshe Sharet was born as Moshe Shertok in Kherson, Ukraine. Levi Eshkol's original surname was Shkolnik. Golda Meir was born as Golda Mabovich, married to a Meyerson. She was born in Kiev. Yitzhak Rabin's original name was Robachev. He was born in 1922 in Jerusalem, the first Sabra. Menachem Begin, his original surname was Begin, from Brest-Litovsk. Yitzhak Shamir's original name was Yezernitsky. Shimon Peres' original name was Persky. Netanyahu's original family name was Milakovsky. Ehud Barak's original name was Brog. Ariel Sharon's original family name was Scheinerman. And I have not yet been able to determine what the Olmert family's original Hebrew name was. The family is from Samara Gubernia in Russia. So, in conclusion, there are not Jewish surnames. Not everyone with the same last surname was related. Surnames were not changed at Ellis Island, and most surnames are not meaningful. To determine what your surname means, you need to trace it back to the time and place of origin. You should work backwards from the present to the past, one step at a time, from census records to naturalization records to passenger manifest, back to the old country. You should use Alexander Bader's books using Soundex to see what his hypothesis was of the surname's possible etymology. Spelling is irrelevant. Keep language issues in mind. Spelling is irrelevant. I will take a few questions if anyone has time. There are over 300,000 different Jewish surnames. I probably don't know the meaning and origin of yours, but I'm willing to take any generic questions.
Wow, wasn't that amazing?
Wow.
That was amazing, Warren. Thank you for that. Did everybody feel like they got a good grounding in names, given names and surnames? Yeah, amazing. Okay, any questions for Warren? I'm going to see if we have any from the online folks as well.
I know it's a lot to take in.
Okay. What was that, David? What are your hourly rates?
I don't have any.
Jewish Jen loves donations. Let's put it that way, right?
There you go.
Okay. Any other questions? One here. Did you hear that, Warren? If the names were changed at Ellis Island, when and where were they changed?
The immigrants changed their names themselves when they started working, when they started school, when they became citizens. It was just a natural part of the assimilation process. As they became more American, they chose American names in a very casual, unofficial way.
Gloria. Gloria is asking about the naturalization process, and didn't that involve matching the changed name to the manifest?
Yes, after 1906, and then again, there were other dates at which point they would match the names to the manifest. So the naturalization papers are the best way for you to find the old name and the new name associated with each other, because those documents will typically have both names. The naturalization certificate itself will have the new name, but attached to the naturalization is what they call the certificate of arrival, which is where they research the original name that you came under and document that to make sure that two immigrants couldn't use the same passenger entry. But naturalization records are absolutely the best way of determining the name in the old country.
Dan, did you have a comment on that, or no? David? Yeah, it changed over time. David's asking, did people have to legally change their names, or how did all that work?
No, there weren't any formal there were formal processes for changing your name, but most people didn't bother to go through them. So you will see records of name changes in various courts, but I doubt more than 5 or 10% of the people actually use the courts. They just started using the new name. And it's probably true for Asian and Hispanic immigrants today. When they come to this country with a Chinese or Vietnamese name, they just start using an American sounding name that might have very little to do with their old name, just to become more assimilated. And often that change is not recorded. Today, we're a bit more bureaucratic and more formal with recording name changes, but 100 years ago, that really was not the case, unfortunately.
Okay, Warren, before you leave us, you have to put yourself on the video camera. You okay with doing it on the webcam so we can see just how youthful you are in spite of your achievements? There he is. Hey. Awesome. I looked up Maureen's question during the break, and Sasha, well, Alexander, you chop off the Alex part, you get to Xander or just the SA. And then Shaw is a diminutive ending, like the Y and Billy, like we were talking about earlier. So it becomes Sa, Shaw. Okay. We're learning, if you can believe Wikipedia. Any other questions?
When I was looking through some Holocaust research, I found that Kerstinblatt was a fairly common name in Radom, R-A-D-O-M, and in another area in Poland, east of Radom town, and I found there were quite a few of those names of interest. That's my father's side's name. In Radom, did they have any particular way of spelling the name or naming people? Were they more towards just picking out the names? And I forget what classification you used, but otherwise you pick out Kerosene is a cherry and blot's a tree, or was there anything, typical of Radom?
So, did you hear that question?
Something about Rodham.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the name what was the surname?
Okay, Kerstinblatt.
Kerstinblatt, and she's asking, did it come from cherry tree or whatever, or was a specific or a more typical?
Radom. Specifically in Radom, was there a specific way that names were formed in Radom?
When they took names on in Radom, was there a specific way that they were formed?
Radom was part of the Kingdom of Poland, where surnames were first required in October of 1821, and it was typically the Kahal, the local Jewish council in each town, that was given the responsibility by the Polish government at that time, the Russian Tsarist government, to make sure that all the Jews in that community had surnames. So each Kahal did things differently. And if you look in Alexander Beider's book, A Dictionary of Jewish Surnames from the Kingdom of Poland, he will show you some documents from Radom and from other places that show the patterns of each town and how they might have chosen it. There was one town, I don't recall which, where pretty much everyone was named after a different type of bird. Other towns, pretty much everyone was named after their occupation. Other towns, it was more towards patronymics and toponymics. So it really varied depending upon each individual set of town clerks and how they decided to give the names to their Jews in their town. There weren't any overall rules. So if you look in the introduction to Alexander Beider's book on Dictionary of Jewish Surnames in the Kingdom of Poland, he should be able to give you some more information about that.
Yeah, and I don't know if we'll have time for consults with him as well. I know he did a breakfast with the experts in Jerusalem, and he's just a fountain of that type of information. You won't get that information elsewhere. One question here, and then we'll go to Gloria. But follow-on question.
Although it seems like one side of the family, Spiesman, that some of the names were German, yet the people lived in Poland. Would that mean that they changed the name, or how is it that? What are some of your ideas of why, like Eisenstark and Spiesman? I think they're both German, yet the people lived in Warsaw and Lodz.
Okay, first you have to realize that many names that seem German to you are actually Yiddish. Yiddish is a Germanic language, just as Germany is. And one of the things that I skipped over in my lecture was the history of border changes in Eastern Europe. And at the time of some of the surname edicts, Warsaw was part of Russia, and a lot of southern Poland was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and both Russia and Austria-Hungary have German as their official languages. So one of the reasons many Polish Jews have German-sounding names is because the names were assigned or given at the time that Poland was occupied by a Germanic-speaking nation, or more likely because these names are actually Yiddish names, and those words mean the same thing in Yiddish as they do in German.
All right, Gloria?
I just want to give a plug for your Discord book on Jewish, and I'm a big fan of them, and I think they're a great resource for all kinds of information, probably for me too.
A plug for the Isker books and another source for information about names.
Sure.
Okay, I'm Jewish Jen. Anything else? All right, let's give Warren a round of applause. And we hope you feel better, get back to health, and thank you for doing this even under not the best of circumstances. Appreciate it. It was fantastic.
Sure.
Okay, Warren, good night. Now,
Thank you.
Now, the rest of you, we're going to have a drawing, so hang on one more minute. All right, Warren, we'd let you pick the number, but you can't do it remotely.
Nope.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.